Hi, and welcome to this episode 7 of the rEView podcast. I'm here today with Josh Welsh. Josh, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
My name is Josh Welsh.
And where do you work, Josh?
I work for Becton Dickinson, and I also have a company in the UK called The Measuring Stick.
How'd you come up with that name?
Um,
Oh, we're off to a
well,
good start already.
my collaborator and I, Vera Tang, like to come up with a lot of puns when we give talks. And we were going to start a non-profit, and unfortunately this business couldn't be a non-profit, so it turned into a business, and I took The Measuring Stick as a name from one of the ideas we were coming up with. There were ruder ones.
What does your company do?
So I made a software starting in my PhD called FCMPass, and then I went on to develop that independently, and then I went to the NIH and I did it some more there. And then it's for flow cytometry standardization, and it's kind of grown with the fields and the standards. And the whole point is to increase the transparency and reproducibility of small particle flow cytometry data. When I left the NIH, because I was the only person that could kind of maintain it and develop it, I got a waiver from the US government to keep the IP and continue to develop it. So that business is a business, but I treat it like a non-profit, so I don't draw a wage from it. And all of the software is free to academic institutions. So I have to try and find money to fund the overheads every year. So I sell it to industry, but that's a can of worms that I partly wish I didn't open, but for better or for worse, it's probably the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean that's really cool, by the way. So something that you started in your PhD, you've taken all the way through, and it's still kind of operating. That's awesome. So let's go back a little bit. So what was the focus of your PhD? What did you actually do?
Well, I should probably go back to my undergrad.
Ooh,
Um,
good. Yes,
so
origin.
when
Can you go even
origin
right
story.
back? Yeah, origin story. Let's start with that.
um, so I wanted to do medicine. I didn't get into medicine. And one of the universities that I went to, they were like, if you did really well in your first year of doing a biological sciences degree, then you can transfer to medicine. In hindsight, that wasn't the case. They didn't select anyone in my year to go in to do medicine. It was more to get people to come to the university, I think. But in the last year, I did a research project, and it was on platelet microparticles. And I'd never done research before. I didn't know what a PhD was. I didn't really know about research. I was completely ignorant to the research world. And we started doing flow cytometry with megamix beads. And I did this whole project. And then at the end of the year, and I really enjoyed it. It was like I was average grades in my undergrad. And then that project in university, I managed to get like the top score in the year. So it was like the one thing I felt like I was good at, and I was constantly emailing the supervisor like, "I've just found something." So after that, Edwin came and said everything we'd done was wrong because of
Edwin Vanderpool?
yeah.
Yeah.
So he came and gave a
He
talk.
was he wasn't your supervisor. He was just a
No.
visiting academic or something.
He'd
Yeah.
just released their single versus swarm detection manuscript in the Journal of Thrombosis and Hemostasis, which basically showed the me theory calculations and applied it to flow cytometry, and why the megamix standardization was incorrect. So with hindsight, I realized a lot of what I was looking at was residual platelets in my project, which is fantastic. But at the end of that project, I realized I wanted to do a PhD, and there was one being advertised for multicolor microparticle flow cytometry for acute ischemic stroke. So that was at Southampton, and then I went and started there. And then that project was basically, in hindsight, like the biobanks there were fantastic. So the university there, they had like a lot of clinical trials on, but they were really kind of democratic, I guess, how they handle those clinical trials, they would actually share the databases around the university, and then everyone contributed, like the samples that they pulled for these clinical trials, everyone would go measure them with all of their different lab techniques and put all of their results into a single database. So you had this huge database with all of the metrics across all of the labs that you could utilize. And there was one for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, acute ischemic stroke. There was one on cardiothoracic bypass surgery, which was a cool one. There were people doing heart transplants and bypass surgeries, and they would take time points literally throughout the surgery. From before right through to the end. That was quite a cool project because there weren't many things that track like a surgery like that. And you can see as all of the as the anesthesias and stuff are going in, how things are changing. So anyway, they wanted to measure all of these microparticles, which are EVs, across all of these samples, and then they didn't have a flow cytometer to do it. The flow cytometry core at the time was looking for a new flow cytometer. That they just got some money, and I got kind of taken under the wing of a flow core manager, and I went round and I was testing all of these flow cytometers with her, just because I was an enthusiast, and she, for some reason, took me with her. And then somehow they ended up buying a BD instrument, but I got in touch with the Thermo Fisher people when we were testing their instrument, and I told them what I wanted to do. Their sales reps put me in touch with the engineers in Oregon, where the manufacturing is based, and their R&D. And for some reason, again, very lucky, but they took me under their wing. They decided to fund us. So I had very, very little funding for my whole 3 years. They started funding us. We bought an instrument from them at like a big discount, and then we basically tore it apart. And we had computers running the fluidics, computers running like the main cytometer, and it was just a big Frankenstein thing. And then, yeah, that's how I got into standardization. I worked a lot with them as engineers, so I learned a huge amount about the back end, which I think is really hard to do as a user. Like, until you actually get in touch with an engineer or someone that actually fundamentally knows how everything is working, it's hard to really grasp the limitations of a technique. And then I became much more interdisciplinary. So the biological project that I was doing, actually, by the end of my PhD, I kind of went and ran like 40 or 50 samples across all of these things just to kind of wrap up my thesis. But the bulk of my PhD was actually developing standardization techniques and trying to fundamentally understand how the instrumentation could be used for EVs and to make it better, and the limitations of it. And then through that, I got in touch with John Nolan. Also helped me a lot. He got funding for me to go to some of the conferences in America around flow cytometry, like CDW. It's like a very small workshop with a lot of old school flow core managers, and kind of like back in the day when flow cytometry had just come out, it was a technique where everyone had their instrument opening and they were tinkering with it. And, you know, the managers fundamentally had to know how the instrument worked and make changes to it and change lasers and fix things. As products have developed, we're now like, everything is a black box. You'll void your warranty if you open it up. And then there's all these trade secrets. So it's fundamentally changed, and actually going and meeting those people that really understand how the instrumentation has developed and how it fundamentally worked was a huge eye-opener. So mixing with them really helped. And then committees started forming, like the ISEV, ISAC, ISTH flow cytometry working groups, and then best practices. And then I got involved in that. Inadvertently, I met Jennifer Jones's postdoc at the time at a conference. She was like an immunologist and like really enjoyed the kind of the uses of EVs, didn't enjoy the engineering side and all of the development. And she had a project, Jennifer and her were working on customizing this big flow cytometer called the Astrios. It's a sorter, and it's much more manual. And she was like, oh, I'm about to leave, but you would really enjoy working in our lab, because it's not so much on the immunology right now, it's on all of the equipment development. So she put me in touch with Jennifer. And then inadvertently, that's how I got my postdoc at NIH, is I moved to NIH and worked for Jennifer. And again, luckily, she was a very small lab. The first year I was there, she just got a tenure track position at NIH. And when you get tenure track, you basically get a big bolus of funding to set up your lab, buy all of your initial equipment. So I was like a kid in a playground, basically. We got to buy a lot of new equipment. The EV field is rapidly expanding, so there's loads of new startup companies. A lot of them, we bought that equipment and then worked with them, and then just fundamentally, like, because I was working with all of these companies, you start, you set up collaboration agreements with them. They'll tell you how the instruments work or things that aren't public information, and then your knowledge builds. And then when you start working across enough techniques, you start seeing the similarities in most of them, whether they're just detecting photons or like just the key principles. And then yeah, that's kind of how it developed. And then I got to the point where at NIH, I managed to work my way up to a staff scientist, which was great. I was fairly independent. Jennifer was a great supervisor, but I was just fundamentally limited with the system at NIH. Like, there aren't enough PI positions there. Obviously, everyone's competing. I probably couldn't differentiate myself enough from Jennifer because we were both very interested in foundational technology development for EVs. And I just decided, like, I was at a crossroads, like, I can't sit in this position. I want to do stuff. I was really frustrated with technology development. NIH is very good at developing like drugs and understanding treatments. They're really bad at translating technology. They fundamentally didn't know how to kind of license it to companies. And companies right now really don't want to license from NIH because the government terms are terrible. So basically coming up with patents ideas, there was stuff that we came up with and I wanted to do that would have really helped the field, and we physically couldn't give it away. We couldn't give away the IP for another company to just use. And that to me is really frustrating because I love technology and I wanted it to be useful. So I thought, well, maybe it's probably time, and because I'm limited here, that I jump over to industry and I can actually start putting some of these ideas into practice and can actually make a difference to the field, which is my main goal. But there's lots of different industries. I started to realize now how I used to see things quite black and white between industry and academia, and then even within industry, working for a huge corporation like BD is very, very different, I imagine, to a startup company. With the dexterity you have in moving between technologies, there's a threshold before they're even interested. So you could make the best product tomorrow, but if it didn't make a profit over, tens of millions of dollars, they're not interested because it's, they responded to their shareholders. So it's with the EV field, that's what's been frustrating to me. We've had a chicken egg problem for a long time, where you come up with ideas and you go to industry and you're like, if you just change your cytometer in this way or this way, it would make it 10 times better and everyone in the EV field could use it. And they're like, well, how big's the market for it? Like, people aren't buying technologies for that. And you're like, well, there's no technologies to cater for it. So how can you measure the market before, so there's this chicken egg problem. But one of the good things about COVID is it seems like a lot of the virology field is actually starting to take up flow cytometry and single particle analysis techniques to check for like loading efficacy, phenotypes and things like that. So that's exciting to me, and I really hope this field keeps expanding. And I'm glad that competitors like Beckman Coulter have made dedicated instruments. It only takes one big company to dedicate resources and step into that field for the field to grow. And then manufacturers will start seeing, oh, actually, there's a market there that we could tap into too. And then they start competing. And it's when they start competing that everyone benefits. But we're not quite there yet, which is one of the main reasons why in my current job I'm focused on standardization, and all of the skills that I've learned for small particle standardization by and large do apply for cells. But the focus really isn't on small particles right now, just because the margin for revenue just isn't there for very, very big companies. And that's partly why there's so many startups in the small particle space.
Yeah, so I mean, it's great to see that even though like you essentially did a mic drop on the EV field, I'm gonna say, like, the guidelines. So lead author on the MISEV 2023 guidelines, and then you were like, see ya, I'm gonna go.
I left so I didn't have to defend them.
And I mean, like, well done, because putting together massive document with so many authors, like the MISEV guidelines, is not something I personally would want to do, because I can imagine how complicated, and communication alone, let alone actually putting all the actual content together, would just be pretty challenging. But it's nice to see that everything you did leading up to, like, has benefited you leading up to your current position at BD. I guess that's why you ended up there. But do you feel like a little bit of like, are you going to miss working with EVs now that you're in industry, or do you see it coming back around again once things kind of pick up in that space?
I mean, I'm not completely out of EVs. I'm still within the company. If there's an EV question, it will come to me. If we're interested in anything to do with small particles, it will come to me. And technically, I still go to like sponsorship conferences, and I support anything that is to do with EVs. And I have my company that is software for EVs, essentially. Do I miss it? I miss research to a certain degree. I miss the flexibility of just being able to chase an idea, whether it's going to be profitable or not. But at the same time, I got really frustrated with the EV space, because so MIFlowCyt-EV, that work started as I was finishing my PhD in 2016. I think the manuscript and the knowledge finally got published in 2020. And I would say that I wouldn't even know as a percentage, but a very, very small number of people actually use it and approach the best practices. And to me, it's just second nature now. Like everyone, I've given so many workshops. I've gone out of my way to teach. I've turned down being co-authors on manuscripts where they wouldn't follow best practices, because I felt like it was hypocritical to preach guidelines if you're not going to follow them yourself. And it frustrates me that the field doesn't catch up, or some people are just so resilient to following best practices. And even when you review manuscripts and you're like, hey, you aren't certain what you're looking at, you don't know you're looking at an EV, and we're trying to, the whole point of publishing is so that we have useful information. And that to me is frustrating. Like, I really enjoy teaching and I want to help people as much as I can, but when ignorance comes into it, that's annoying. I get really frustrated at the manufacturers. There's a lot of misleading information that they're using as marketing material, and they're embedded within societies because they're funding them. If you say anything too brash, within guidelines maybe, or manuscripts, you get pushback, a lot of pushback, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, because these people, industry ultimately, are funding all of our conferences and things. They're the sponsors.
Yes, I did think about that quite a while ago. I was like, this is pretty
Yeah.
like conflict of interest wise. It's yeah.
But it just frustrates me in that regard. So in some ways, the field isn't very big yet. It isn't. It is rapidly progressing, but the technology use cases are frustrating to me. And part of it, it's not all of the researchers' fault. Like ISEV Tech a year or two ago, I can't remember how long it was ago now. And I really need to finish this manuscript. But one of the things we did there is we did like a standardization study. So we sent them, all of the manufacturers that sponsored, we got to measure a single vial, a single lot of these EVs. So everyone got the same thing. And then we compared the metrics that all of them shared. So diameter was probably the only one really that they all managed to do. And I wasn't interested in the accuracy of the diameter measurement. We compared it, and it's very different, and it was, a lot of it was expected. But the main thing I wanted to compare was, how did they actually get to diameter? Because none of these techniques measure diameter. They might measure impedance, they might measure photons, they might track the particle, which is based on Brownian motion, right? So fundamentally, they've had to make a lot of assumptions. And for us to be transparent, them going from their primary measurement metric to diameter needs to be reported. And it showed that almost no one had a completely transparent pathway, and no one reported best practices. And even if you wanted to report the settings of a technique, like we could all have the same instrument and be, completely unanimous, like this is the best technique. But if we all use them at different settings and get different answers at different settings, then just reporting those settings is critical. Many of the techniques didn't even report their settings. So even if a user wanted to follow best practices and make stuff as transparent as possible, they couldn't, because industry wasn't putting all of the metrics there for them to report. So there was a constant fight going on, and one of the things that I tried to do was use all of the positions I had to not bully, but to find ways to influence industry to follow best practices, so we had as much transparency as possible. And that was like doing this thing like ISEV Tech, where I could go, oh, actually, flow cytometry reports absolutely everything pretty much for raw data. Why aren't all the other techniques doing this yet? So that all of the other techniques, well, actually, we should do that. The bad side to flow cytometry is it doesn't calibrate the data. They still rely on third-party tools for the most part. So why aren't they doing that? And these small startup companies are doing that. And you need to kind of play these companies off each other, because they don't respond necessarily to what you want. They respond to competition and what others are providing. But there are obviously, exceptions to that. But that's the only way I could find to try and move the field forward, because until they start doing this, what I realized from doing MIFlowCyt-EV and MISEV, like MISEV, when we were writing 2023 from 2018, they'd had a big checklist in it at the end. There was a checklist for reporting. Almost no one used it. I don't think it was even 1% of manuscripts utilized that checklist. And until we make things almost autonomous, people aren't going to do it, because it's just extra effort, it's extra admin, it delays manuscript publication. That was one of the reasons I wrote the FCM Pass software. So FCM Pass, when it calibrates your data, it catalogs everything, and then it throws it all into a report. So absolutely everything is transparent and MIFlowCyt-EV compliant. The only thing they have to report is their samples, and the software, it would report that if it knew what your samples were, but there's a limitation to what you can pull from FCS files. But yeah, I think finding a way forward for the field to follow best practices was where I started getting really frustrated with technology, and I kind of reached a point where it's just time, and that's why I'm not very patient, I guess.
Yeah, I guess if you're like very adamant about certain things and you're doing all these things to try and change them, and yet there's a lot of resistance to that uptake, I can completely understand where the frustration comes in, and all the time that you put in that you probably feel is a little bit wasted in some respects. But yeah, I mean, like the same goes for lots of. Obviously, ISEV has been very forward about bringing about guidelines for nearly every aspect of working with EVs, including like sample type specific. So like the My Blood EV guidelines as well. And obviously I review papers for the ISEV journals, and I see lots of papers on blood EVs that since the My Blood EV has come out, like they're not using the checklist. And I think to me, it's like, well, you're submitting to an ISEV journal. What do you think the reviewers are going to say? Like, of course, they're going to say, can you implement the things that we've put specifically there that are going to help make your research more transparent and ensure that you've taken appropriate course of action to at least know what you're working with, or measure the things that will help us understand better what you've come up with in your samples and how you've applied it. So yeah, there's a lot of I think like there's this balance between what is practical for a lot of labs, and then like this very high expectation, or seemingly high expectation from ISEV with regard to what should be reported. But it's all there for good reason for the most part. And obviously, like the MISEV guidelines are a consensus document, so not everything was 100% agreed upon by everyone, but it's like, here's the consensus view, and we'll break it down for you to let you know how many people agreed with this particular thing. But yeah, there's going to be limitations, because not everyone has access to the best instruments or the best facilities, and a lot of research is about making the most of what you have available to you. And it's just, when they get put into these awkward situations of the PI got a big grant for working on EVs, and maybe the I don't know, the institute or wherever, like it just not is not well equipped to deal with that. So like the students then are like struggling to try and get together all the required information, and like I've had lots of setbacks in my PhD working with a experienced group of EV researchers, and things changed in the field, and then we had to change absolutely everything if we wanted to publish, and luckily in the university I was at, we had access to the right instruments and stuff, but it could have been better. Like we could have done things in a more rigorous way. Like we had a nanosite, so some people call them random number generators, and do I agree with that? Probably. I mean, the size, as you were saying, like diameter could be different on multiple different instruments on the same sample, and that I think that rings true for NTA especially. The concentration seemed to be pretty good. Like that was pretty reproducible. How accurate it was, who knows? Like unless you do the multiple comparisons between different instruments, you're never going to know. But yeah, like there's lots and lots of limitations that we just have to acknowledge. That is just part of life as a researcher, as a student, if you're working with EVs. Being aware of these things is definitely good, but I mean, there's always limitations, but I get the frustration if things aren't changing after a lot of work at education and things. But as you say, like maybe it's then about the actual institutions being made aware of this, and again, money, funding is always going to be a fight.
I think dissemination's a huge part of it, and you just can't. Like I've done a lot of teaching, but they're in select places, and there's a certain amount of teaching, right? I've realized how I keep coming back to flow cytometry because that's my thing, and I'm sure everyone's yawning about it because they don't care. But I teach a flow course every year, like a hands-on one, and I teach workshops at conferences every year, and there's a certain amount of theory you can teach everyone. You could teach someone in theory how to drive a car. If you put them behind a wheel of a car, it's going to be different. It's going to be a different experience. And I think this is also where dissemination is really hard. Even with techniques, I started showing this dad making a peanut butter sandwich with his two kids, and getting them to write an instruction list. And I think it's so apt because, I mean, who is there to train? Like maybe for a technique that's relatively new out or that isn't properly utilized, there's a handful of experts in the world. Maybe there's 10. How do you get those experts to pass over that knowledge to everyone in the world and get them to use things properly? And for flow, that was quite a big handful of people. We tried to write best practices with MIFlowCyt-EV. We wrote a 90-something page compendium of all of the background theory behind it. Some of that's transferred over to MISEV and endorsing it. This has been published across societies. We've gone to all of these societies and taught. We've taught workshops at all of these societies, and still people don't know how to use flow. And I still visit, I've visited customers and I go to individual labs all over the world and they just have no idea. And the flip side of it is even some of these, multi-purpose pieces of instrumentation, the company's engineers themselves don't have the tools, the training to even optimize these instruments for that purpose. And education is critical. And that's the one thing where I think hands-on is just one of the hardest things that we can transfer. And I don't know how we do that efficiently. I'd love if ISEV could have like a hands-on workshop, but at the same time, you need to teach people in small groups if it's going to be useful, and there's 1,000 people there. So, it wouldn't work necessarily, but I think something like that needs to change because our field is just rapidly developing. And on the guidelines, like you say, like how many people knew of my blood EV, right? It's
I did.
You did.
Well, yeah. That doesn't say much. So, yeah, I mean, this is I love that we have these guidelines. I don't think there's enough done to disseminate them globally. Like, it's a global community. And it's
And we're
like,
swimming
okay,
in
we're gonna,
information right now. Like,
yeah,
which source of information do you listen to?
yeah, like they're gonna be made. They're gonna get published in JEV, and people who keep up with the ISEV journals will pick it up. But what about everyone else who may not be as familiar or who's new to the field, doesn't know where to start? I mean, I just think it's not exactly, I say fair, but like, what are your expectations of, like, you make these things, you want them to be taken up, you want it to be implemented, but you're not doing enough as a society to actually educate people or provide the opportunity for people to find out about them. I think dissemination, as you've touched on already, is kind of key, and I think it's lacking.
And that was one of the reasons I joined the education committee on ISEV. I wanted to find ways to kind of help educate. And I also kind of realized there that ISEV has reached a point of, like anything with critical mass, where you need to be responsible for the information you put across. And then suddenly it doesn't become efficient anymore because everything needs to be checked. You need to be putting out the right message. Is there consensus on the message you're putting across? Am I bad mouthing a technique that's a big sponsor? And, maybe we need to reassess what we're saying and make sure that everything we're saying is actually accurate before we go ahead and just sprout that out. And it isn't necessarily a societal thing to disseminate. Maybe it's just individuals, and then it's like there could be noise because people might be teaching the wrong thing. But I'm
Well,
not
yeah,
sure
that's
it's.
the other thing. You need like endorsement behind the people who are actually like doing the dissemination. So if you leave it up to everyone, like the wider community to do it, it may not exactly be done in the best way.
Yep, but they'll be able to do it faster. They'll be able to react more. So there's a balance. I think the societies definitely need to step up a bit more, maybe with hands-on stuff. But it's also very hard for them to do. And there's who teaches it. I might disagree with someone's isolation method or separation method, I should say now, for MISEV compliance. Um, but yeah, it's difficult. I think things are really going to change. I'm really hoping that, like right now, if you publish something in JEV and you want to follow best practices, and these aren't journal guidelines, like the editor, Jan, has been fairly vocal about saying, we'd like people to be compliant, but we're not going to enforce it because it might stifle innovation, which is fair enough. But none of these are, they're endorsed by the journal. They're not required by the journal. But if you follow best practices and you have to commit to MIFlowCyt-EV, maybe MyBlood-EV, MISEV guidelines, you might have to upload to EV track. If you've got RNA data, you might have to upload it, somewhere else. That's just 5. You have to go to all of these different sites. They have all of these different forms. They're all maybe overlapping in certain areas. It's starting to get bureaucratic. Like it's an admin problem now because someone's probably going to spend a week trying to put all this information together.
Yeah.
They might be doing it in retrospect and realize that they don't actually have all of the information available. We need automation really is the key, I think. And that's
Okay, I'll tell you a secret, and it's not going to be a secret because it's on the podcast, but like 2 years ago, I thought of just an idea, and it might be like a crappy idea, but this is my idea, and it was on the line of automation. And I was like, so you've got EV track as a separate tool, but people are going to be submitting their work to ISEV journals, right? Obviously, like I say most of the time. In a lot of cases, people working with EVs might be submitting to the ISEV journals. And wouldn't it make sense to just have a fully integrated platform where it is automated, where you can be like, here's everything in the one
there's
place. You don't
people that
have
are
to go
talking
back
about
and
that
forth.
already. The problem, so yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some grandiose ideas out there, like let's harmonize everything, take responsibility, one uniform platform. That's fine. Totally agree. It'd be great. Where's the funding going to come from? Because someone has to develop it, and it's expensive. And the other thing is a lot of the NIH grants for these, they tend to come from there. They might come from another source. everyone's behind creating the platform. There's very, very little money about maintaining the platform. And that's where the real problem comes in. And that's why sometimes these single monolithic platforms to do everything actually aren't necessarily the best way to go. If the society's funding it, maybe. So in ISAC, there's a flow repository that was funded by ISAC, and you upload all your FCS files there to make it transparent. That has become a nightmare. That software is 20 years old. You can't download all of the files anymore. And they've been negotiating for 5 years how to integrate this with another platform that's actually run by a journal. And they're having to pay a lot of money for it. And inadvertently, the journal is then going to gain a lot of rights to the data and things like that. So I agree with all these ideas. And some of these things are things you could build yourselves. It's all about money. And where's that money coming from? Who's going to dedicate the time and the work? Where's their wage going to be paid from? Like that's where the crux fit, what it comes down to.
All I'm hearing is problems, not enough solutions.
Well, I think there are ideas to try and link these platforms to have like APIs where they talk to each other. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but I know there's some RNA platforms and an EV track, and they're thinking of ways to join the two so that you can cross-verify information and link reports and things.
Yeah, clearly, like, I'm not a software engineer and I've got no idea. But, these are, as you say, grandiose ideas that in some...
They're good ideas. Yeah, they're hard ones to implement, and especially in an area that it is a small field. It's not going to solve, a huge number of people's problems, right? I think ISEV's membership is starting to plateau now, as far as I know, which would suggest that, while not everyone doing EV research is an ISEV member, it does show that we're reaching almost critical mass to some degree until there's another boom of interest in EVs.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of thought with the rising interest in therapeutics that it may pick up again soon, but like you're going to have a lot of crossover from people in like immunology and oncology and stuff like that are looking for answers to.
So those are the people that I think are the most dangerous.
Why?
Well, I've met so many PIs that are their expertise is on something else, and they just want to dabble in EVs. So what do the EVs look like? And they're
Why wouldn't they just collaborate though? Like, isn't that a
well, I mean, who's going to get last authorship?
Oh God, so political. Also, I meant to say before, when you mentioned the education committee, disclaimer, I'm just joined the ISEV education committee, so anything I've said about ISEV is not a criticism as such. It's just like I'm looking at gaps where we could improve things. And I think it's stuff, by the sound of it, that you probably had already put on the table when you were on the education committee as well.
I completely understand why it is the way it is. And, they do need to be accountable for what they put out. It's just anything that gets to a certain size has to be careful. And I think that's why I got to the point where I with education, I kind of felt like it was easier and quicker to educate potentially by myself, have my own videos. And, if you have your own blog or something, I think educating that way is probably quicker. Maybe if you can get endorsement for some of it. But at the same time, if someone else was on the education committee and they decided they wanted to do a load of stuff on flow cytometry and what they put out was wrong, I'd be annoyed. I'd want to say, how did this get put on the website? Why are you teaching people this rubbish? So I understand why it needs to be that way. I just don't know what the solution is.
Yes, well, I mean, this is the state of things. It's like, as we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about, there's all these issues that don't really have clear-cut answers, and it takes a lot of brainstorming and agreement before you can make any progress, and people are often very short on time for these things as well. It's like being a part of ISEV and any of the committees, it's not like that's the only thing anyone does. It's like
absolutely
everyone has a full-time job on top of anything that they do for ISEV. So yeah. So,
and a lot of the stuff you teach, right, there isn't a best. Like, I've heard so many people say, oh, we need to teach on like, what's the best separation method? And you're like, well, it depends. Like, there isn't a best one.
Yeah,
Like, you
this
can't
kills me.
educate on,
Every conference, every single meeting, it's like, what's the best EV isolation method for
yeah.
this? And it's just the same answer. It kind of depends on what you, what are you doing with it? Yeah. So tell me some more about what it's like now that you're at BD. Like, how's life changed? I mean, I think I can guess that you're going to be working regular hours now as
Yeah.
opposed to crazy academic life.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. My life is very different. Like at NIH, in academia, I feel like your progress is down to you. You need to be a brand. You want to try and I'd want to have so with manuscripts, right? I turned down being a co-author on manuscripts I didn't agree with. It wasn't about the manuscript number for me or the number of citations. I tended to try and get on. I wanted to only be on manuscripts that were good quality, so that people would associate good quality work with my name rather than someone who just publishes a lot. And I felt like you got out what you put in. Like if I work overtime and I publish more, it's going to be better for my academic CV and for my own progress. Like I'm holding myself up. So you're almost like a small business. And I did work very long hours. I worked, I worked on multiple committees. I was on the ISEV board. I chaired the reference materials task force. I was on the ISEV, ISAC, ISTH committee. I taught at workshops. I was an associate editor for a journal. I reviewed a huge amount. I was going on all cylinders when I left NIH, and essentially the EV field, I dropped everything. Like my business is technically my spare time now. That's been a pain to set up and a bunch of stuff running a business I never even thought about. But I have a lot more routine, and I got unhealthy, to be quite honest, working too much, and even just going to the gym and stuff is something I didn't do, and I do now. I also have to commute a lot more now, which is annoying living in
Yeah,
California.
what did you say it was? Like an hour and a half each way or something ridiculous?
Yeah, if I leave it, my commute's changed recently. Jet lag has enlightened me. But
So
so
getting up at 4.
I get up at 5:30 now, and I get to work for 7, and then I leave at kind of 2ish if I don't have any meetings in the afternoon, and then carry on at home. And the other benefit of my job is I'm 3 days on site and I have 2 days at home. So that alone has been fantastic. I was fully remote until I recently relocated. But yeah, I guess I just have a lot more routine and time to myself. And I don't miss having to. I was always anxious about what I needed to do to progress. And when I was really disappointed that I felt like I couldn't get to the PI step at NIH, and I just didn't want to do it in academia. I don't want to be a grant jockey. I've got a lot of respect for PIs that manage to do all of the grant writing, managing all of their lab and keeping the resources and the lights on, and still managing to do the science, and some of them even getting in the lab. But I really wanted to do science. Like the reason I did a PhD is because I love technology and I always want to be in the cutting edge and I always want to learn. I don't want to do admin. I want to do as little admin as I can possibly do. And at BD, that's where I'm really enjoying it. I don't do any admin really. Even ordering, like at NIH, ordering was a real pain. And now it's just I send a form to someone and say, can you order this for me? And it turns up. I don't have to enter receivings and get quotes and things like that. So I just have an easier lifestyle, I think, and I'm constantly just learning. Like the pace of where I am now is a lot faster because ultimately we need to bring a product to market, and the quicker you can do that, you're going to save the company money. You're going to ideally beat your competition. And everything is like go 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 go. But at the end of the day, you're not expected to work. If you want to take PTO, no one's going to contact you when you're on PTO and expect you to pull something out. Like it's been very you can silo things a lot easier, I think. And I think there are going to be exceptions to it, with critical projects. But so far, it's been enjoyable to have it as a job and not as a lifestyle.
Yeah, I see your point. I mean, this is the general feedback I think about moving to industry anyway from academia is that it feels like a better work-life balance. Academia can really like just drive you into the ground. Obviously the hours are set, but not really. Like you might be expected to work weekends, you might be expected to work after hours if you've got something like a
I
grant
should
deadline
probably
or
say as like a note, like I was never expected to work out of hours. I chose to, and
okay, like yes, we can say no one is expected to work out of hours, but they do. They
they
do
do.
because you need to get stuff done. Like if you've got
Yeah,
a full week of lab work, where does the extra time go into writing up that paper or putting in that grant or doing any of the other admin stuff that comes with being in academia? So, like, no, not expected, but
it's
definitely,
stages
yeah.
of life as well, right? I mean, I moved to NIH when I was 26, and I lived on my own. I was in a long distance relationship for 4 years. I lived on my own for 4 years. I used to work stupid hours. I didn't sleep very much. I enjoyed it. Like I was so into what I was doing, and that's why I did it. But I'm in my 30s now. Like I'm in the next chapter of my life where I need to think, well, actually, maybe in the next 10 years, I want to buy a house. I'm probably going to settle down, and I can't keep this up. So if I'm not getting paid enough to buy a house and support a family, and I'm working ridiculous hours to just earn the wage I'm on, and there's no progress prospects for me, I'm in the wrong line of work. And you need to make that decision whether it's worth it for you intellectually. And I felt that it wasn't. I felt like intellectually I could be stimulated by industry just as much and get paid better and have a 9 to 5 or a 7 till 2 job. And I think that's the other thing is it's just stages of life. Like I was happy to do that in my 20s and I'd do it again.
So, were you writing grants at the NIH for yourself?
Not really. So there was a couple that I was like codes on, but the NIH is a funny place because we can't receive external funding. There's only a very finite number of grants we can get because we're essentially a government. We're not academic. So it's a little bit different there. But no, and I was grateful for that, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to be a PI at NIH. Is while they do need to write grants to supplement, and Jennifer did, they get a set amount of funding every year to do research, and they get an allocated number of positions that are safe to be in their lab. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to be a PI there, because it gave you the freedom to supplement your income if you wanted it. But you also had a stable lab that you could run, even though the downside to it is some of these super PIs that are writing and getting loads of R01s can have massive labs. That doesn't tend to happen as much at NIH. But I was happy being able to. There are PIs there that are in the lab and managing the lab, so it's still a big job. But they had enough time to be a bit more engrossed in the research side, which appealed to me.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I thought NIH essentially operated like other academic institutions, but you say, yeah, government obviously makes sense. And people are writing grants for NIH funding. So, and I guess you were a staff scientist as well, which takes on a different tone to being a postdoc, right?
I was a staff scientist for about, was it a year? It might have been less. My promotion, I got told I was going to get promoted, I think a year before I got promoted. All of
Oh,
that's how long the bureaucratic kind of side goes on there. The admin side is horrendous, and all of the documentation they have to do because they're public funded government stuff. So yeah, the pace of it was terrible in that sense, and all of the paperwork, and we had a lab manager, and it was a full-time job for them to handle all of the paperwork for the lab and keep it all going. But yeah, I the staff scientist side, I also annoyed me because they had 3 tiers, and the 3 tiers were basically like a number of things that you needed to hit, like competencies. I'd hit all of the competencies for the top tier of staff scientist, but you also just need to sit in a position for a certain amount of time. So although I'd already hit all the competencies for the first one, I'd have to sit for 10 years in that position to get to the top tier. And that's not about how good you are anymore, or, you know, how successful you are. That's just how long you sit in a position. So
Yeah, more
that again to me,
procedural than actual reward
yeah.
for your work. Yeah.
And that was really off-putting for me, because now it's not about how productive I am, it's just a safe job. And that's, it's good for some people that are interested in safe jobs and enjoy, that level. I just have a problem where I always want to be next tier, next tier, next tier. What do I need to do next?
I mean, that makes sense. I think it's pretty typical of anyone working in a scientific setting. Like, you're always looking, like, you hit a goal and then you're like, okay, like, what's next? So that, I think that's normal. But it's frustrating if you couldn't hit that goal just because, as you say, you need to sit in there for 10 years. Yeah. I was going to say, so I like to always ask all of my guests this question. So even though you're technically out of the EV field now that you're at BD, although still with your software in the EV field, where do you see, like, what's the most exciting thing in the future of the EV field, or what's the next big thing to hit it?
The next exciting thing to hit the EV field.
Biased or unbiased answer, I don't care.
I think therapeutics ultimately, I think diagnostics will be useful, but I think therapeutics, if we can really get a handle on how to load and target EVs to certain organs or treat certain conditions, I think that's probably the most powerful route forward, and probably the one with the most amount of funding with biopharma. I think diagnostics is going to be a lot harder to get into just because of the lack of standards and the variability between our equipment. I think the technology's there. I just don't think there's enough people with an understanding of the technology and all of the best practices that are in those companies necessarily to utilize it right now. Maybe that will change. I think AI is really going to change science in the next 10 years. I think it's
We're
exploding.
Nobel season, and definitely the AI people have been awarded this year, so that's pretty
That
amazing.
worries me the most, with scientific best practices, paper writing, data manipulation.
Yeah, all the manipulation is definitely terrible. In terms of efficiency,
Yep.
like it's like having a personal assistant. Like, while I wouldn't get AI to write a paper for me, but I use it to help speed up the drafting process and create outlines based on what I give it as a prompt. Totally, and I think that's what most people are using it for at the moment.
And I think that's one of the places where, if you can, like we were talking about reports and ergonomics of that, if you can show it a set of folders with all of the data in it, say, hey, scrape this data to fill out these 3 forms, and leave what you can't find. That's where power comes in for actually pushing these guidelines. I think something like that is actually going to be the real game changer, rather than relying on a platform to do it all for us. I think that's exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting times ahead in the next 5 or 10 years. We'll see what happens. All right, well, I think it's probably time to wrap it up. But thank you so much for being a guest and fielding all my very random questions. But yeah, it's been great having you on. And I guess, like, this is the point where I say bye to the listeners. So bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
No worries.